Can we please welcome them? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Bernard A.Haykel. And I come to you from Princeton University in the United States. I'll be talking to you about Saudi Arabia, Iran, and West Asia, or what in America is less correctly called the Middle East. And it is a great honor and real privilege to be with Max Rodenbeck and with Robert Worth, two of the best journalists that I know who cover West Asia for The Economist, New York Times. And Robert has a book on the Arab Spring events, which I strongly urge you to read. It is actually available here. And Max has a wonderful book on Cairo. I don't know if you have another book since that one, but it's a terrific book. So I would urge you to have a look at their works. So let me tell you a bit about the Middle East or about West Asia and what's happening. And I will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to a discussion here on stage, and then finally open it up to questions from the audience. So the Arab world is really in the grip of a major struggle that can be seen from Morocco all the way to really the borders of Afghanistan, maybe even into Pakistan. There are effects of this throughout the region, or what is often called the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa region, or the wider Middle East. And the two principal antagonists or protagonists in this conflict are Saudi Arabia and Iran. But before I get to either of these countries, I need to explain a bit about why we have come to this situation. And it is because there is a major vacuum that has been created in this region. I think one could trace it to the end of the Cold War, what Americans call the first Gulf War, what the Arabs think of and the Iranians think of as the second Gulf War, which is in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And then the United States, along with a coalition of other countries, but principally the United States, came into Arabia, smashed the Iraqi army, liberated Kuwait, occupied part of Iraq, but never did not complete the job of dismantling the Iraqi state. This was something that would take another 13 years to happen. In 2003, when the United States finally decided to invade and occupy Iraq and finally smashed the Iraqi state, creating a major vacuum, a vacuum that has since been filled by Iran in the case of Iraq. And this vacuum that is largely, I think, due to American involvement and military involvement in the region, was followed up by a policy of now the last president, Obama. And his policy was to pivot away from West Asia or the Middle East towards Asia. And his interest in the Middle East declined very considerably. And the argument there was that the Americans had been over-committed in the Arab world. They had done too much. And so now was the time to do much less. Of course, President Obama was still very heavily engaged in the Middle East in at least two ways. The first was in the war on jihadi movements, especially Al-Qaeda and then later the Islamic State, using often special forces and largely predator drones. These are unmanned drones to strike at jihadis throughout the region. And the second way in which he was also involved in the region was in ramping up the sale of weapons to the allies of America's allies in the region, so that as of last year, Saudi Arabia is now, for example, the third largest, in terms of spending, the third largest purchaser of weapons in the world after the United States and China, in terms of how much it spends on its military. Most of this is bought from the United States. So Obama was disengaged but also engaged in very particular ways. And that created certain dynamics in the region. The Saudis, for example, felt that the Americans had abandoned them. And the Saudis also realized that they're incapable of defending themselves from an external aggression. So for them, the US was always their backstop, was always the country that would come and defend them should they have to face an external aggressor. And so it unnerved them that the Americans were no longer there for them. And this came out very dramatically in an interview that President Obama gave to a journalist called Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic magazine, where he clearly distanced himself from the unquestioned alliance that the United States had with Saudi Arabia since 1945, the end of the Second World War. Now, the other thing that happened was, as I told you, the Iraqi state was smashed and the Iranians moved in and filled that vacuum. And that story has been told very well in a number of articles, some in the New Yorker, for example, by Dexter Filkins, who I think is here, or I hope is here. In any case, the Iranians moved in, and the way the Iranians operate is very particular to the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is that they are very keen on using non-state actors. They develop militias that are wholly beholden and loyal to the regime in Tehran. The classic example of this is that of Hezbollah in Lebanon. But they've created similar militias in Iraq. Now there's a 100,000 at least man army in Iraq, or a militia that is loyal to the regime in Tehran and not loyal to the Iraqi state. They're doing something very similar in Syria, and they've done that also in Yemen with a movement called the Houthi movement. In essence, the Iranians have used a particular policy of developing non-state actors that are trained by what are called the Revolutionary Guard Corps of the regime. And this is a way of projecting force and creating a sphere of influence that now runs from Tehran all the way across Iraq into Syria and to Lebanon, with certain factions of the Palestinians also loyal to Iran, and then down south in Arabia to Yemen. And there is talk of them developing similar capacities in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia as well as in Bahrain. So in essence, the Iranians are creating a sphere of influence that would create a noose around Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are very unnerved about this and want to push back. Ideally, the Saudis would want the Americans to push back, and they would want to use the Americans to do what we call the heavy lifting, the military effort against the Iranians. The Americans are not willing to do that. So as a result, what the Saudis have done are several things. One is they've ramped up a sectarian rhetoric, an anti-Shi'i way of talking about Islam, which is part of the DNA of the particular form of Islam that the Saudis adhere to and believe, which is called Salafism or Wahhabism. And so sectarianism is one card that the Saudis have deployed or have used or thrown on the table. Another is to build up their own military capacity, their army, and as I said earlier, they're now the third largest spenders when it comes to military expenditures and arms purchases and imports into the kingdom. A third way is to actually confront the Iranians directly through the Iranian proxy in Yemen, and this is the Houthi movement. So the Saudis have been involved now for over a year, actually close to 2 years, in a war, mainly through an air campaign in Yemen, trying to defeat this militia in Yemen, very unsuccessfully, I hasten to add, because you can't win in Yemen militarily by the use of air power alone. The other thing that the Saudis have done, again for the first time since 1973, is to use oil production as a weapon. The Saudis have been, since 1973, when they used oil production as a weapon that one time, because of the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, have never used it again. There are a number of reasons why they didn't use it, but mainly it had to do with the Americans disciplining the Saudis against attempting this use of oil as a weapon after 73. So they never did use it, except recently, last year, when they decided that they would not cut oil production in order to maintain a deliberately low oil price that they hoped would severely harm the Iranian economy. This policy has not worked, and they've since abandoned it, but they're perfectly capable of using oil as a weapon again. And the other thing that the Saudis have done, just like the Iranians, is to whip up nationalism within Saudi Arabia, as the Iranians have done in Iran, against each other. So the Saudis against the Iranians against the Saudis, also Shiism versus Sunnism. And these dynamics that both the Iranians and the Saudis have adopted have had ramifications throughout the region, have had sort of, you can see it like a ripple of waves across the entire region. So that now the war in Syria is very much seen as a Sunni versus Shia war. Similarly, in Lebanon, you have a very strong cleavage and tensions between Sunnis and Shias, in Yemen as well. And it does not bode well for the future at all. One of the core problems for the Saudi-Iranian relationship and the tensions is that each country sees that dynamic in zero-sum terms. And unfortunately, this is something that is very common in the Middle East, where you do have conflicts that take on the zero-sum dimension, where it's a winner-take-all attitude that doesn't allow for compromise or any form of reconciliation that is based on compromise, especially when a country like the United States is no longer pushing for that kind of compromise in a very serious way. So the region is in a sense left on its own, and it is spinning out of control. And you have other countries around that, whether it's Turkey or Egypt, or Libya, that are mired in their own domestic problems and are unable to also play a role in this region. And most recently, with the war in Syria, the Russians have gotten involved. So in broad terms, the region is really in a mess, and I can't say that I am optimistic in any way. And there are also, not just because of this dynamic between the Iranians and the Saudis, but there are also structural reasons, whether to do with demographics or water, lack of water, authoritarianism, climate change, poor education. I mean, if you look at any indicator of development, with the exception of perhaps literacy and infant mortality, the Middle East is on a downward trajectory. And it contrasts very dramatically with what I see in India. For instance, just to give you a small example, the session we just had earlier on the British Empire and its role in Indian history would be inconceivable to have, I think, anywhere in the Middle East. It would not be possible to have that kind of conversation. And that's just one small example that I can give. But what I see in India is a very different trajectory from that of the Middle East. I see large numbers of people who want to be educated, large numbers of people who want to get ahead, with all the problems that I'm sure this country has, it is nonetheless headed in a direction that is almost completely different from that of the Arab world in particular. And this is something that I would like to draw Max out on, as well as Robert, because I think they know these two regions very well, and they can speak very eloquently to these issues. Thank you.
Bernard, thank you for that excellent and very sobering summary. I wanted to ask you about the way that people talk about Saudi Arabia in the United States and Europe, which has changed in the past couple of years in a very striking way. I don't think there was ever deep public love for Saudi Arabia, but they were viewed in the United States, the country was viewed as kind of, our sons of bitches. And certainly at the presidential level, there was a very, very strong bond. There was a feeling that it was very important for the president and his advisors to be close to the Saudi royal family. And in the past couple of years, it's become fashionable, I guess I'd say, to talk not just critically about Saudi Arabia, but to describe it as the source of all the problems in the region. More of a problem, in a way, than Iran, despite the fact that the United States has such a, traumatic history with the Iranian regime. And I'd love to hear your take on how that's happened, why we see so many op-eds, and it's not just journalists, but members of the United States Congress, a whole range of people who are suddenly speaking out and making Saudi Arabia the prime villain.
Okay, I mean, it's an interesting question to which I don't think there's a simple and straightforward answer. But what I can say is that there are a number of factors, some not obvious. So for instance, there's been a revolution in the production of oil in the United States called the shale revolution in oil and gas. And that has given rise to a whole new way of talking about oil. A talk about energy independence in the United States, of not needing these countries that produce oil. So that creates, to begin with, the possibility of imagining a world where you can be unchained from this problematic region called the Middle East or called West Asia. And by the way, I should add that neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia would even be worthy of a session like this had they not had oil. I mean, it's oil that allows them to project force, to create armies, to buy weapons, to do all the things that they do. So that's one issue. I think there's another issue in the United States, which is that in America, Americans have been really unnerved by first the 9/11 attacks, and then most recently the Islamic State, and especially the very able use of the Islamic State of social media and videos and YouTube and that sort of thing to show very horrific killings. I think there's a deep sense that has been pushed by people like President Trump now and others, that the problem lies with Islam, that the problem is Muslims, not a particular subset of Muslims called the Islamic State. And that has created, I think, in the United States, a sense that, especially among liberals, as you know, a sense that, it would be very difficult. It's one thing for President Trump to talk about Muslims. It's quite another for a liberal American to say the problem is with Islam and with all Muslims. So you need to find a bad type of Muslim, so that you can, as it were, both exonerate yourself as a good liberal, as not being an Islamophobe, but also to avoid tainting or painting the entire community of Muslims with the brush of terror. And so Saudi Arabia is a very convenient stand-in for the bad Muslim. Mahmoud Mamdani, who is a scholar actually of Indian origin, but from Uganda, wrote a very interesting book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And in that book, you see that throughout the Cold War, the West has wanted to always identify the good and the bad in the Muslim world, based on alliances to do with Cold War politics. I think something similar is still at play here. And the Saudis are very useful and good and easy targets for abuse and hatred in the United States. They have three characteristics that stand out to my mind. First, they're rich without having earned it. The oil money just comes out of the ground. And that's something that Americans don't generally like, although they're beneficiaries of oil as well. But the second is that they're misogynist. They don't treat women well. And the third is that they're intolerant. So on three scores, they're really sort of bad people. Although they've been, as I said in my earlier comments, extremely loyal to the United States. In fact, if there is one way to describe Saudi Arabia, is that it has been probably the most loyal country in terms of providing service to empire, to American empire, since World War II. And especially after the oil boom of 1973. The Saudis were spending lots and lots of money all over the world to support American causes against communism. The most, of course, famous example is that of the jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. So I think there are all these factors that come to play. And lastly, there's one small issue which often foreigners don't understand or see, which is that if you're a lawyer in the United States and you're looking for the biggest pot of gold in terms of money to make in courts through trial, if you go after asbestos or you go after tobacco, those two have now been resolved in the courts. The biggest pot of gold for a trial lawyer today is the Saudi government. If you can accuse the Saudi government of having been involved in the terror attacks of 9/11, you can basically gain, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in court proceedings. And this is what has been worked on for now well over a decade by the families and these court trial lawyers, which has culminated with the passing of a bill in Congress, a law that now permits American courts to bring Saudi Arabia to trial.
Bernard, aren't you being a little bit easy on the Saudis? I mean, in broad terms, I would agree with you, but I think that there is one has to make a distinction for one thing between Saudi Arabia as a nation and the Al Saud family.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite true that the Al Saud family has been extremely loyal to the United States since World War II. It's a very strong alliance and one of the oldest and strongest American alliances. But it's really with the Al Saud family. I mean, I'm not so sure about Saudi Arabia as a people, as a nation, whether they feel that sort of loyalty to America. It's a political choice. I also think that there are sins, perhaps if we are to be kind about sins of commission, there are sins of omission by the Saudi rulers, which is that they have indeed sponsored forms of Islam that are really quite radical,
yeah,
whether by desire or simply by not paying much attention and spreading the money very, very widely and generously across a broad range of things. So they have indirectly or directly funded extremism in many places. And I've seen that. I mean, I've spoken to Saudi princes who speak of this as buying our insurance. We buy our insurance by paying off these very radical preachers, for example. They after the attack on Mecca in 1979, King Fahd at the time, in order to counter this wave of growing wave extremism, he simply opened the coffers and just gave money really rather indiscriminately to all clerics.
Yes. So, look, I have a very idiosyncratic view on this matter. I've studied it very, very carefully. So the Saudi royals and the Saudi government has spread an intolerant form of Islam called Salafism. But intolerance does not lead to violence necessarily. In fact, if you look at the profile of any recruit or a group of recruits, the Islamic State, it's impossible to identify them by socioeconomic class, by ideology, by psychological makeup. It's very difficult to make the connection between intolerance and radicalism. People end up getting into militant radical movements through all kinds of means, not just through the Salafi way. In fact, there was an article in The Hindu just 2 days ago here that said about 52 of the jihadis who the Indian government claims to have arrested, half or more were not Salafi. There were Tablighis, there were converts, and so on. And I have something to add to this. So I've studied Salafism in India for some time, and I've been to a number of the institutions that the Saudi state has funded in this country. One of them is something called the Jamia Salafiyya, the Salafi University in Varanasi. Another is the Sanabil School in South Delhi, in what is called Batla House area. If you look at the Salafis of India, and here the Saudis have spent millions, tens of millions of dollars, and built institutions, given scholarships, brought Indians to Saudi Arabia, educated them, brought them back here, and so on. You actually see that none of the Salafis that have received Saudi funding have ever joined a jihad, whether global or Kashmiri. They've not been to Kashmir. Most, in fact, ended up, they may hate Shiites, they may hate Sufis, but they're not militant at all. And in fact, if you speak to the Salafis here who have received Saudi funding and are open about this, and this is not a secret, the Saudis are not hiding it either. They are proud that they have a constitution in this country, that they represent a vote bank in this country. So in fact, if you look at specific examples of Saudi funding, such as the one here, you don't see that connection with jihadism. Another example is the United States, where again, the Saudi role was to, very interestingly, and there was a recent dissertation on this, was to de-radicalize the African American Muslim movement and turn it into a loyal, patriotic American movement. And that was a Saudi effort that was deliberate. And lastly, I would say, there are 5 or 6 countries in the Middle East where the Saudis never built a mosque, never gave a scholarship, never built a school. They are Iraq, because of authoritarianism, they were not allowed in. Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, 5 countries. In all of these countries, you have jihadis that are not produced by the Saudis. In fact, Tunisia, on a per capita basis, has the largest number of jihadis of any Muslim country in the world. So I think that connection has yet to be proven. Although you may be right, but it's yet to be proven.
Bernie, I wanted to ask you a bit about Syria. The Saudis tried so hard in Syria to persuade the Obama administration to support the Syrian opposition and to provide them, especially with higher caliber weapons like shoulder-fired missiles. I mean, I myself talked to the Saudi ambassador to the States at that time a number of times, and he told me how hard he was working to do this. And of course, the Americans insisted, no, we don't want that to take place. And ultimately, Obama did not. I mean, there was support to a variety of groups, but there was nothing like what the Saudis and the other Gulf countries wanted. And now, of course, Aleppo has fallen to the Syrian regime. The Russians are in place. Bashar is talking about taking over the rest of Syria, which frankly, I for a long time thought was absolutely impossible. And now I've almost begun to wonder if maybe he could. Certainly the United States, with Trump in power, is not going to do anything for the Syrian opposition, which leaves the question. The Saudis, after all, still see Syria as this battlefield on which they are fighting against their great rival, Iran. Are they going to continue fighting there? And since we're talking about battlefields, why don't we ask about Yemen as well? Here are 2 places where the Saudis see themselves confronting the Iranians. In both places, they're not doing very well. The Iranians seem to be winning. How do you think they will handle that? Because after all, many people now seem to think that if Syria, if people follow Trump's lead, essentially, and say, okay, look, Bashar is a horrible, horrible, bloodthirsty dictator, but he's essentially won. Let's fold our cards and, allow him to reassert control. The argument is that however morally appalling that might be, it might mean less bloodshed in Syria. The Saudis, I think, may not accept that argument because for them it's the Sunni opposition that they were supporting. It would mean a victory for Iran to do that. Maybe they'll keep on supplying weapons to the rebels. In fact, maybe now that they won't have the Obama administration involved, they won't have, Trump's going to withdraw further. Maybe the Saudis will now say, well, what the hell? Why shouldn't we give shoulder-fired missiles to the Syrian opposition? What do you think is going to happen there?
So I think that the Saudis do not have the capacity to project force. One of the principal differences between them and the Iranians is that they don't have, unlike the Iranians, non-state actors that they can deploy and be certain that those non-state actors will be loyal to them. In fact, very often, at least in the case of Afghanistan and Pakistan, when the Saudis did spend money on jihadis, these jihadis inevitably and invariably turned against them and said, you know, you're not Muslim enough, and we're going to actually attack you. And you have to remember that the principal target of both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is Saudi Arabia, the government of Saudi Arabia. It's not the United States or the West. The prize is Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis can't deploy non-state actors reliably. As such, they are handicapped, and that's why they want the Americans to do the bombing for them.
Could I just add a tiny little thing, which is that they can't even really rely on their allies to a certain extent. I mean, when the Saudis asked Pakistan to join in the Yemen campaign, they were told no, despite having given the Pakistanis...
And the Egyptians as well.
The Egyptians the same.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the only country that's come to their side recently is the Sudan, on Yemen, for instance. So they have a problem. I don't think that the Saudis would ever cross the United States. I mean, if there is a sense or really an order that you're not to give the Syrians shoulder-fired, what are called manpads, these shoulder-fired missiles against airplanes, they won't do that. And so I think what they will end up doing is spending money, probably on actors who can't deliver on their promises, and try to see how else they can hurt Iran. One of the ways in which they can hurt Iran is really, I think, oil production, and which would affect the price of oil. But that's a problem too for them because it hurts them, because they want a high price of oil, just like the Iranians do, because they're both producers. On Yemen, I don't think they have a solution. Militarily, Yemen is like Afghanistan. You can't win. The British realize that. I mean, everyone has realized, Americans, Soviets, and so on. And the Saudis are learning that lesson now. So I think that, the effort of the Saudis building their own capacity, their own military capacity, largely to face Iran eventually, is going to take at least a decade, if not longer. And what we'll see is this internal effort to reform the economy, to diversify it, and to build their military. And whether they're successful at that is a big question. I'm doubtful, frankly, that they can do that.
I'd like to get if we can go back a bit to this whole question of American decline in the Middle East. I mean, I think India has experienced this quite often in its history, that the moment of a decline of an empire is a moment of extreme danger. The vacuum created by the decline of the Mughals allowed the British to invade. When the British Empire was crumbling, partition happened, bad things happened here. The same things happened in the Middle East quite frequently as well. When the Turks left the Middle East, when the Ottoman Empire crumbled, there was the partition, Sykes-Picot, et cetera, that created the rather wobbly nation states that we have now. Is what is happening now in the Middle East just about the decline of the American empire and the vacuum left behind by that?
I think it's more than just the decline of the American empire. I think it's also about these very large populations, and where the state, until until the 1970s, the state could provide government employment, could provide education, could provide healthcare. The state is no longer able, just because of the numbers of people that are in the population, is no longer able to keep its side of the bargain in the contract, and that's fraying. And the fraying of that social contract, combined with the American decline and the rise of forces, extremist forces, a much more assertive Iran, all of that is unhinging the region. And coming back to now President Trump, he has sent very mixed signals on the Middle East. On the one hand, he wants to be with Putin and with President Assad. On the other, he wants to destroy Iran and tear up the nuclear agreement. So those really don't fit well together. You can't be with Putin and against Iran. They're allies in the region and are operating very much along those lines. So I think we're in a period of great flux and great uncertainty.
But has American policy in the Middle East ever squared its circle? Hasn't it always been contradictory?
I think on two matters it has never veered. One is its unquestioning support for Israel. And on the other is its, again, unquestioning support of the Gulf countries where so much oil is produced. I think on those two matters, America has been extremely consistent. And of course, with that comes, securing maritime shipping lanes and maintaining kind of American domination and force projection into the region. That is now being questioned. I don't think that Israel, though, is being questioned. It's the bit about the Gulf and force projection that's being questioned.
I think we should take some questions from the audience.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. Right at the end, you mentioned Israel, right?
Can you speak into the microphone?
I hope that works. So two powers at either end of the Middle East, or West Asia, Israel and to an extent Pakistan. To what extent do you believe they will want to maintain a status quo of sorts, given the fact that Iran seems to be in the ascendant vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia?
I didn't hear the question, did you?
Quite catch it, did you?
Okay, let me try again.
Yeah.
To what extent do you believe Israel will want to maintain the status quo between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
Got it.
I'm happy to address that quickly. I think that Israel has been very lucky in some ways. This rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia has played to Israel's advantage. The big fear for Israel is a united region against it, and this Sunni-Shia rivalry has made that absolutely impossible. So I think Israel has never been more secure than it is now. It's the sole real, well, that's not true. It's the major winner right now from what's happened in the Middle East, and is facing very little pressure as a result.
Yeah. If I can add just a little footnote to that. In Saudi Arabia, there's a conviction. The Saudis the regime is a Sunni regime, and the majority of the population is Sunni. The regime and the Sunnis are convinced, and this goes back to colonial anxieties. They're convinced that there's going to be an alliance of religious minorities across the Middle East or across West Asia, and that this is going to be at the expense of the Sunnis, so that sooner or later the Iranians, the Israelis/Jews, the Christians, another community called the Druze community, another community called the Alawite community, all these communities are going to band together and control an arc from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean, and that alliance of minorities is going to emasculate and keep the Sunnis, the Sunni Arabs of the east, of the eastern part of the Arab world, in weakness and in decline for the next 1,000 years. As a result of this paranoia or this fear of an alliance of minorities, the Saudis actually are tentatively, some say not so tentatively, making overtures to the Israelis. In other words, making the case that a Sunni Jewish/Israeli alliance is a stronger and more reliable one than a Shiite Jewish-Israeli alliance. That is what's going on in the background.
I just wanted to pick up on two things you said. Can you hear me? Is that right? One, mentioned that the Saudis are partly culpable for sort of Al-Qaeda through their funding of non-state actors in the 1970s, and also that the US had have to this day, or now maybe not, unquestioning support for the Saudi cause. Therefore, can you join the two dots and say that the US are in part responsible for the rise of Al-Qaeda through not confronting Saudi Arabia on their funding of non-state actors in Afghanistan?
Yeah, there's no question in my mind that the Americans, and in fact the anti-Saudi argument that Robert Worth was mentioning, is a way of not talking about American culpability in the production of jihadism, of the jihadist phenomenon. So if you say it's Saudi Arabia's fault, then America is innocent. In fact, America, in the 1950s, under President Eisenhower, was making arguments to the Saudi leadership that in the name of the fight against communism, why don't you use Islam as a card against the communists in Syria? That was the first letter in 1957. The Saudis in 1957, in response to that American request for an American or Eisenhower's jihad, Saudi said, thank you, but no thank you. We're not interested. It was only after 1962, when President Nasser moved troops into Yemen and there was a coup in Yemen, that the Saudis came on board with this idea of an American/Saudi jihadist project, which ultimately culminated in Al-Qaeda. And in the case of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was formed in 1988. That product was, that movement was the product of literally a dollar for dollar spending by America and Saudi Arabia in the war against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. You cannot disassociate the United States from jihadism. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. Do you think the Saudis could, or the Gulf states could make? Do you think the Saudis or the Gulf states could make an alliance with Israel work, either above board or even below board, if the U.S. tries to move the embassy to Jerusalem, or if it gives up almost completely on any opposition to settlement policy?
I'm not sure I can handle that.
I think it would certainly make things much more difficult for the Saudis. If there's some kind of alliance, it would have to be further under the table after a move like that on the part of the Americans. And I think, frankly, this notion of a Saudi-Israeli alliance, and Israelis talk about this as well, by the way, it's not a one-way street. But I think it's in some ways a rather unnatural thing. Historically speaking, the more natural alliance is actually an Israeli-Iranian alliance. It just happens to be that the current Iranian regime is not amenable to that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that moving the embassy, the American embassy to Jerusalem is going to complicate things. You know, the Saudis are willing to, under the table, do things with the Israelis, especially on matters to do with intelligence and security, but a more open and overt political agreement would require Israeli concessions on the question of Palestine. I mean, there is a public in Saudi Arabia that will not go, that will not tolerate the leadership making an agreement and selling out the Palestinians. I think the Israelis probably are hoping that that's eventually what will happen. But I don't think the Saudis would be able to get away with it, even if they wanted to.
Good evening. I would like to know why Saudi Arabia has not invited refugees from Syria to Saudi Arabia. Seriously, because I think this would have sent very good signals.
About Syrian refugees in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, well, it's a good question. I mean, after all, you know, the countries around Syria have been enormously generous. The Turks, for instance, the Lebanese, the Jordanians. And I think the Saudis are anxious about having a large population of Arabs that they can't necessarily control. They've certainly been criticized for not taking more. After all, the Saudi regime, the royal family speaks about the suffering of fellow Sunnis in Syria. But after all, they have a lot of foreign labor, and they handle them very, very carefully. They see them as potential trouble. And I think when they've been questioned about that, which they have been repeatedly, they've referred to all their financial generosity to humanitarian work and stuff, but they certainly are holding the line that they do not want to accept a population that could potentially down the line pose a threat to them.
If I could just add that it's not the Saudis alone, it's all the Gulf states. all of the wealthy Gulf states have had the same policy. But at the same time, there are hundreds of thousands of Syrians who do live in Saudi Arabia and work in Saudi Arabia and have for generations, decades. So they haven't made a specific policy to bring in more refugees, but they have actually, de facto taken in quite a few people.
The Saudis claim that they've taken in about 2 million Syrian refugees and that 1.4 million have left. In other words, they've only kept 600,000 of the 2 million that came in. I'm not sure how accurate these figures are, but what I do know for a fact is that the existing Syrians who are in Saudi Arabia, and there are several hundred thousands of them, their families were all allowed to come in. So they've been very accommodating of relatives of existing residents in Saudi Arabia, and there are certainly several hundred thousand who have been let in, but not sort of like the way Lebanon has let in sort of large numbers, or Jordan or Turkey.
Sorry, I had a question. If you could just, okay, hi, yeah. Mike, I just wanted you to clarify or say a little bit more, or to explain what you meant when you said that for for ISIS or for Al-Qaeda, that the actual prize or the actual, is Saudi Arabia and not the United States and not any Western country. So just curious why Saudi Arabia would be more of a target than the Americans or any other Western country would be.
So if you read the let's say ideological or cultural production of Al-Qaeda's leaders or those of the Islamic State, they want Saudi Arabia, they want to take over Saudi Arabia for two reasons. One is because if they were to take over Saudi Arabia, they would have Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities and mosques in Islam. So their claim to leadership in the Islamic world would be immediately boosted through control of the holy cities. The second is the oil revenue, the oil wealth, because both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State argue that if you control the oil, and they have very autarkic economic ideas, they don't believe in free markets. So they think that if they control the oil, they can set the price. And if they set the price, $200 a barrel, for instance, was bin Laden's estimation of what the price should be, they could then generate revenue with which to spread Islam. And that is, after all, the purpose of both movements, according to their own narrative. There's a question in the back?
Yes, right here. I have a question right here.
So there are lights, so I can't see that well.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon. Right here.
Yes.
What role do you see the Kurds playing in this kind of dichotomy between Saudi Arabia and Iran as they grow a little bit more powerful or influential with their oil reserves in part of Kurdistan, but also have a very divisive and fractured disagreement between the Kurds in Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq? What role do you see them playing in between Saudi and Iran?
Well, the Kurds always say that the Kurdish people have no friend but the mountains. And I think that's sort of the case because, it's the world's largest nation without a country, so to speak. And they're spread across different countries, including Iran. So Iran does not look very kindly on some sort of powerful independent Kurdistan because this bears on what happens to the Kurdish minority inside Iran. And with Turkey, obviously, it's the same thing. It's not clear what the outcome is going to be in Iraq and Syria, where the remaining Kurds live. And it looks like, the one part of Kurdistan which has become de facto a more or less independent state, which is the Iraqi Kurdistan, is going to be boxed in by various other players. And despite the success of the Kurds with the help of the Americans in Syria, in that small part of the northern Syria along the Turkish border, it's very unclear how this can survive or go forward. That particular faction is not friendly with Iraqi Kurdistan. It's obviously not friendly with Turkey because they're the same political group that's run a rebellion in Turkey for the last several decades. And their likely resort is to make a deal with Assad in Syria. which will not necessarily leave them in a very strong place. So for the foreseeable future, the Kurds will likely remain divided with perhaps a more or less independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq. It's hard to see the Kurds having a better outcome than that.
Yeah, maybe one more. All right. This gentleman. Yeah. Just there. Yeah.
Hello, Anwar. Good evening. I think you spoke mainly about the fight between Shia and Sunni. But if you see the history of Saudi from the 1920s, from the end of the when the Saud took over Mecca and took over Riyadh, you could see that also it was mainly a fight against the other obediences in Islam, against Hanafiya, against Malikiya. So it's not only a fight between Shia and Sunni, it's also a fight for the homogenization of the Islam in all the Muslim region. And United States played also, Europeans played, and we didn't speak about something today. We haven't spoken about British and how British people influence and how British people played a big role in, for example, putting Saud's family in Saudi Arabia. So that is my point regarding the Saudi. And last, I have a question regarding Iranian. So we spoke a lot about the messianism of Saudis, but what about the messianism of Iranians who today, for example, are going till Morocco and saying that Morocco was Shia in the 7th century during the Idrisi time, and don't worry guys, in the long run, everyone will become Shia.
I mean, you asked several questions there, but you're absolutely right that, essentially you have the equivalent of two caliphates, a Shi'i caliphate in Tehran and a Sunni caliphate in Riyadh, and they both have their own version of Islam, and they're both trying to propagate and promote their own version. The Saudis are, the Wahhabis, are principally against Sufis and Shi'is. They also have some issues with other types of Muslims called Ash'aris. Those are theological differences. So you're right, they are intolerant. And they have tried to homogenize Islam. And by the way, that process of homogenization is not just their doing. I think there's something in the processes of modernity, the greater literacy of Muslims, the desire to interact directly with texts, the collapse of traditional forms of authority. All of that has actually helped this homogenization or the Salafization of Islam across the entire world. It's not just a Saudi effort. As far as the British are concerned, the Brits were banking on another horse. I mean, they were backing another horse in Saudi Arabia, the Sharif Hussein, who was a pathetic leader, just was given 100,000 gold coins a month but didn't know how to spend it or didn't want to spend it. And they were only giving 5,000 gold coins to Ibn Saud. Ibn Saud really outwitted the British. He was not their principal candidate in Arabia. And he managed to just win over. Without really, I don't think you can just blame the British for his success. His success was, I think, partly due to internal dynamics within Arabia. And the Saudi state has been repeatedly lucky because they've often faced either pathetic opponents like the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, or they get the Americans to come and discover the largest oil fields in the world, and that gives them a boost. So they've been very lucky, and the luck so far has not run out. So let's see what happens in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard A.Haykel, Robert Worth, and Max Rodenberg. Can we please give them a big round of applause?